Good afternoon. Welcome to the Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to interstate water disputes, as Goa is opposing the Mahadai project of Karnataka, through which Karnataka proposes to divert the water of Mahadai into Malprabha river to enhance the drinking water supply of Belgavi, Dharwad and Gadag districts of Karnataka. The second article is related to cyber security, as there was a data breach at the Indian Council of Agricultural Research leading to the loss of crucial research data. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified section which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to interstate water disputes. The context behind it is that Karnataka wishes to go ahead with the Mahadai project, but Goa is opposing it. Through the Mahadai project, Karnataka proposes to divert the water of Mahadai river into Malprabha river to enhance the supply of drinking water in the Belgavi, Dharwad and Gadag districts of Karnataka. But Goa has concerns related to its probable ecological impact, the impact on flora and fauna in Goa, the impact on navigation in the Mandovi river in Goa. Therefore, we'll take up 3 case studies related to interstate river water disputes, the challenges that are faced in the resolution of interstate river water disputes and the suggestions in this regard. This is important in GS2 under the topic Dispute Resolution Mechanism and Institutions, and also in GS1 and GS3 under the topic Water. First, let's start with the Mahadai river water dispute. Mahadai river originates in Karnataka. It flows through Goa before falling into the Arabian Sea near Panji. The origin lies near the Bhimgad Wildlife Sanctuary in Karnataka. The tributaries of Mahadai river include the Kalasa Nala, Banduri Nala, Rogaro, Kushavati, Nanorem, Nanus, Valvota, Mapusa, etc. The basin of Mahadai river lies in 3 states: Goa, Karnataka and Maharashtra. Maximum basin lies in Goa, 78% of it, 18% in Karnataka and just 4% in Maharashtra. It also flows through the Salim Ali Bird Sanctuary in Goa. Now, the dispute arose related to the project proposed by Karnataka, the Kalasa Banduri Nala project, which proposes to divert the river water into Malprabha river. To resolve the dispute, the central government in 2010 established the Mahadai Water Disputes Tribunal. The interstate river water disputes in India are not adjudicated through the courts, they are rather adjudicated by the tribunals. The tribunals are set up by the parliament using the power of Article 262 and under the Interstate River Water Disputes Act 1956. The Section 4 of Interstate River Water Disputes Act 1956 empowers the parliament to set up the Interstate River Water Disputes Tribunal. The Mahadai River Water Dispute Tribunal gave its verdict in 2018. The tribunal observed that Karnataka should get access to 13 TMC feet, whereas Goa should access to 24 TMC feet and Maharashtra should get access to about 1.3 TMC feet of the Mahadai river water. The second case study is related to the Kaveri river water dispute. Kaveri is also known as Dakshin Ganga and it is a significant river in the state of Tamil Nadu. It has its basin in 3 states and 1 union territory: the state of Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala and the Union Territory of Puducherry. This river water dispute has a long history. In 1892, there was a dispute between the Presidency of Madras and the erstwhile princely state of Mysore. The two reached an agreement in 1924. The Presidency of Madras and the princely state of Mysore had a 50-year agreement for the sharing of the Kaveri river water between the two. This agreement lasted till 1974. After 1974, after the expiry of this pre-independence agreement, Karnataka started diverting the water of Kaveri river. The diversion happened to 4 newly built reservoirs in Karnataka. This naturally caused a grievance in Tamil Nadu, which started facing water shortages. Therefore, Tamil Nadu approached the central government. The central government constituted the Water Disputes Tribunal, again using its powers under the Interstate River Water Disputes Act 1956. The Kaveri River Water Disputes Tribunal gave its final award after a long delay. finally after 17 years in 2007 it gave its final award, as per which it observed that the water should be divided between the two states as per the different periods of the year. There should be different divisions and there should be the establishment of a monitoring authority to ensure that the award that is announced by the River Water Disputes Tribunal is implemented by the state of Karnataka. But the River Water Disputes Tribunal did not give any detailed formula in case there is insufficient rain. In case there is a deficiency in rainfall in a particular year, the River Water Dispute Tribunal award simply observed, then the proportional share of both the states, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, will be reduced proportionally. But even for the notification of this award given by the tribunal took a long time. The government finally notified it after 6 years in 2013. Even after that, Karnataka did not implement the award announced by the tribunal because Karnataka expressed its inability to implement the award. This time, Tamil Nadu government approached the Supreme Court under Article 136 through a special leave petition, because otherwise it cannot be approached as it is forbidden under Article 262, whereby the awards are given by the tribunals which are final and the adjudication of interstate river water disputes is to be done by the tribunals. And in 2018, the Supreme Court gave its judgment observing that Kaveri is a national asset. It upheld the water sharing arrangements finalized by the Kaveri Water Disputes Tribunal broadly, and it even constituted that there should be a Kaveri management scheme and the setting up of a Kaveri Water Management Authority as well. The third case study is related to the SYL canal, the Satluj-Yamuna Link Canal. This also has a long history. In 1955, the waters of Ravi and Byas rivers were calculated, and they were supposed to be divided among the three states. The undivided Punjab, which constituted of the Punjab and Haryana of the present day, and the state of Rajasthan and the state of Jammu and Kashmir. But in 1966, the Punjab Reorganization Act was enacted, and accordingly Punjab and Haryana were made separate states, and therefore the Satluj-Yamuna Link Canal was also planned. By 1980, Haryana had completed the Satluj-Yamuna Link Canal in the state of Haryana. The SYL canal lies in both the states Punjab and Haryana. In Haryana about 90 kilometers portion and in Punjab about 120 kilometers portion. But in Punjab there were protests by a political party, the Shiromani Akali Dal. Therefore the Satluj-Yamuna Link Canal could not be completed there. And in 1985 there was also the insurgency in Punjab. Due to that, the Prime Minister of India had an accord with the Shiromani Akali Dal, and therefore the Iradi Tribunal was constituted to divide the river waters between the states of Punjab and Haryana. But due to the militant insurgency in the state of Punjab, there was even the killing of the chief engineer, the superintending engineer of the Satluj-Yamuna Link Canal project, and the work could not be taken up. By 2002, the Haryana government approached the Supreme Court seeking for a direction to Punjab for taking up the SYL canal project work. But after that, Punjab came up with an act, the Punjab Termination of Agreements Act. Through this, Punjab revoked its agreements regarding the river water sharing with the neighboring states. This was also challenged in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in 2016 observed that the Punjab Termination of Agreements Act is invalid and Punjab cannot go back on the agreements that it had made earlier. And in 2020, the Supreme Court even observed that the chief ministers of both the states of Haryana and Punjab should negotiate and the centre should mediate to resolve this dispute. Now coming to the resolution of the interstate water disputes, how is it done? The Article 262 of the Indian Constitution explicitly bars the jurisdiction of the courts. That is, any state cannot approach the courts, even the Supreme Court also, for the resolution of the interstate river water disputes. If a state is approaching the Supreme Court, they are doing so under Article 136, which allows for the filing of a special leave petition. But conventionally, the resolution of interstate water disputes happens through the constitution of tribunals by the central government, and the tribunals go for the adjudication of the dispute and give the final award. And the tribunals are constituted under the Interstate River Water Disputes Act 1956. Pre-2019, the temporary tribunals were constituted by the central government. The central government constituted the tribunals if a state was approaching the central government for the resolution of the interstate water disputes, and since they were temporary tribunals, they were dissolved after the final award of the tribunal had been announced. But the award of the tribunal had the force of a Supreme Court decree, as if it is a Supreme Court judgment, and therefore it is final and binding, it cannot be challenged. Although the states which had grievances from the awards of the tribunal also, they started approaching the Supreme Court under the Article 136, filing a special leave petition. There are some governance related challenges also in the resolution of the interstate water disputes. For example, the states go for adversarial litigations like challenging the tribunal awards also in the Supreme Court, and it leads to the chronic delays in the resolution of the dispute. And even after that, the central government also sometimes takes time in the notification of the final tribunal award as well. And there is no avenue to redress the grievances after the tribunal has been dissolved, since they were temporary tribunals, and it may lead to a crisis situation as well. A constitutional crisis pitching the legislature against the judiciary. For example, the Karnataka government itself observed that it is unable to implement the award announced by the tribunal even after the Supreme Court asked it to implement it. And it may lead to an institutional vacuum also, because although the award is announced by the tribunal, but there is no implementing body. The implementing body should be there to ensure that there is no institutional vacuum, and at times there are concerns related to vote bank politics and the allocation which has to be done separately for the deficit years in the years when there is insufficient rainfall, and there is problem related to the data management as well. For example, the absence of transparent information gathering and the sharing of data between the states who have the basin of that river. So what can be the solutions that we can propose for the resolution of the interstate water disputes? One, the solutions have to be multi-pronged. That is, legal solutions only will not suffice. We need institutional solutions, we need political will, and we need technological solutions also to ensure the river water management and the resolution of the interstate river water disputes. The government also came up with the Interstate River Water Disputes Amendment Bill in 2019. Through this, the central government proposed the setting up of a committee, the Dispute Resolution Committee, which should be approached by the states which have a grievance regarding the interstate river water sharing. This committee will try to resolve the dispute within a timeline of 1 year. And if it is not able to resolve the dispute within 1 year, another 6 months can be given to it. If even after total 1.5 years the Dispute Resolution Committee cannot resolve the dispute, then the dispute should be referred to the tribunal. And the tribunal will not be a temporary tribunal, it will be a permanent tribunal. The permanent tribunal will try to resolve the dispute within a period of 2 years, and this can be extended by another 1 year. So the update by the central government tries to fix a timeline, the total timeline for the resolution of the interstate water disputes, 3 years by the tribunal and 1.5 years by the Dispute Resolution Committee. That is, within a period of 4.5 years total, the dispute must be resolved. And also it proposes to set up an expert agency, the expert agency for the data collection, to ensure that the rainwater data, the irrigation, the surface water data is collected at the basin level. Also, we can propose the utilization of the Interstate Council for ensuring that the states come together for discussion and collaboration through the Interstate Council, which is constituted under Article 263. Plus, the Supreme Court observed that the distribution of the river water between the states should not be based upon equality, rather equitable distribution should be there. There should not be numerical equality of the river water distribution, rather equitable distribution based upon the Helsinki rules and the Campion rules, which propose that there should be some parameters for determining how much share should a state get out of the river water, out of the river that flows through that state. And those parameters may be based upon the hydrology of the basin, the climate of the region, the socio-economic needs of the region, the past utilization trends regarding the utilization of that river water. If a state has been using more river water share in the past, then he should be given more river water in future also. And the Supreme Court also observed that the state is not the owner of the river water, rather the state should function like the public trustees, ensuring the equitable distribution of the river water. Additionally, we can also propose the adoption of 4R, that is reduce, recycle, reuse and recover, to ensure the sustainable utilization of water resources. There is a mains practice question as well. Interstate river water disputes have been a challenge in India's federal structure. Examine the key challenges in resolving these disputes, discuss the constitutional, legal and institutional mechanisms in place, and suggest measures to ensure cooperative federalism in water sharing. Please try to write it. There was a previous year question also in 2013 asking whether the failure of the constitutional mechanisms in resolving interstate river water disputes is due to structural or procedural inadequacies or both. The next article is related to cyber security. The context behind it is that there was a data breach at the Indian Council for Agricultural Research, leading to the loss of crucial research data, even recruitment related data. So we will discuss the challenges associated with cyber security, the institutional architecture in India to ensure cyber security, and the suggestions to improve cyber security in India. This is important in GS3 under the topic Basics of Cyber Security. Let's start with the basics related to cyber crimes. According to Joseph Nye, the cyber crimes can be categorized under 4 headers broadly: cyber espionage, cyber attacks, cyber warfare, and cyber crimes. Cyber espionage means the intrusion to steal information. Information is usually stolen by the cyber criminals and it is sold to the non-state actors to other countries, usually to gain monetary benefits. And the cyber crimes may include those which have electronic fraud, for example, identity fraud, credit card information theft, etc. The cyber attacks are for the interruption of the digital services, interruption of the digital systems, usually through DDoS attacks, the distributed denial of service using botnets, etc. And the cyber warfare means large scale digital attack. The large scale attack can be done usually on the critical infrastructure of the country, for example, the attacks on the nuclear power plants, etc. Now, when we look at the common cyber crimes, they may include identity theft, social engineering, phishing, etc. Phishing means you get an email and it has an attachment, it has a malware attached along with it. If you download it, your data is stolen. Social engineering means that the cyber criminal tries to gain your confidence and then tries to extract sensitive information, personal information from you. And when we observe the sophistication levels of the cyber crimes, it has increased with time. If we plot the sophistication levels versus time, we see that it has been increasing. For example, in 2000s, there was the resorting to hacking. There was viruses and the trojans which were sent to you via emails, etc. By 2010s, the cyber criminals also evolved and there was the attacks in the form of distributed denial of service. And presently, if you observe, there is further sophistication level. For example, the usage of deep fakes and the usage of AI in the cyber crimes as well. If we observe the incidents of cyber attacks in India, they increased from 2015 onwards and there was a huge spike during the times of COVID because of the digitization of the services. Now, what are the challenges associated with the cyber security? We can see that there has been a spike in the recent times in the number of cyber attacks. For example, in 2023 itself, there was a ransomware attack on a defense unit, a critical defense unit in India. In 2023 also there was a data leak from the ICMR, including the Aadhaar data leak. And it is estimated that there was a loss of about 1.24 lakh crore rupees in India in 2020 due to the cyber related incidents. As per some estimates, the number of cyber crimes in India increased by almost 500% during the times of COVID due to the digitization of the services, the online payments, etc. Also, the critical infrastructure is especially vulnerable, which is targeted by the adverse elements and the alien countries. For example, in Ukraine, the electronic systems which are attached to the Ukrainian warheads during the initial phases between the Russia and Ukraine conflict, they were targeted by the hackers and they were rendered ineffective through GPS jamming. Likewise, the Iran nuclear power plants were also targeted through the Stuxnet in 2010. The Petya ransomware targeted the European Union banks. Also, there is an underpreparedness. Although the CERT-in, the Computer Emergency Response Team India, issues the guidelines for ensuring cybersecurity, but the stakeholders who have to implement them, they are underprepared. And at the same time, the private sector participation in the field of cybersecurity is still limited in India. Plus, there is the added complexity due to the invent of the artificial intelligence, machine learning, data analytics, cloud computing, the Internet of Things, the technological and the legal issues. It leads to the adding of a layer of complexity in the ensuring of cybersecurity. And with the adoption of 5G and the quantum computing, the potency of the malicious software has also increased. Also, there is the challenge of us becoming financially vulnerable in case the SWIFT system is attacked, because through that only the inter-country financial transactions take place. The banks are connected through the SWIFT system with each other, and the personal data is also sold on the dark web, for example the credit card information, further leading to financial frauds. And there is the upcoming threats, the new threats also, which keep on evolving, and the cyber criminals come up with new inventions, for example digital arrests, the risks associated with the Internet of Things, because almost all the household gadgets are connected to the internet. Now let's have a look at the institutional architecture in India for ensuring cyber security. At the apex, there is the National Security Council Secretariat. It is the apex body forming the political, economic, energy and the security strategy. It is the apex body, and under this functions the National Cyber Security Coordinator, which coordinates between the various agencies ensuring cyber security in India. Then there is the National Information Board. The National Information Board enunciates the policies for ensuring cybersecurity, and it is headed by the National Security Advisor. Then the National Cyber Coordination Center has been set up by the CERT-in, the Computer Emergency Response Team, and it is functioning under the NIB, the National Information Board. What does it do? It comes up with the cybercrime prevention strategy, investigation training, and the reviewing of the outdated laws, the archaic laws. There is the National Crisis Management Committee also, which is the Apex Crisis Management Committee, and it deals with the cybersecurity related crisis also, and is headed by the Cabinet Secretary. Then there is a CERT-in, the Computer Emergency Response Team India. It monitors the cyberspace, it coordinates the alerts, it gives the warnings to various agencies, and it detects the cybersecurity related threats as well. Then there is the NCIIPC, the National Critical Infrastructure and Information Protection Center, and it functions under the NTRO, the National Technical Research Organization. It was set up in 2014. Also, there is the Indian Cybercrime Coordination Center, which was set up in 2020. There are some more initiatives also. For example, the Cyber Surakshit Bharat initiative, that is to spread the awareness related to cyber security and to avoid the cyber security related crimes. And the Cyber Swachhata Kendra, which is a botnet analysis and malware cleaning center, and the Pradhan Mantri Gramin Digital Saksharta Abhiyan, ensuring that there should be digital literacy and the cyber security related awareness in the rural areas also. There are some international initiatives as well for ensuring cyber security. For example, the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which seeks to harmonize the national laws to ensure cybersecurity globally, but India is not a signatory of the Budapest Convention. Also, there is the Global Center for Cybersecurity, which is an initiative of the World Economic Forum. In India, if we see, there is a need for restructuring the cybersecurity architecture, because the cybersecurity ecosystem is fragmented. The Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, the National Technical Research Organization, they all have their own cybersecurity units. Additionally, there is the specialized units including the CERT-in and the Indian Cybercrime Coordination Center, and therefore there is no unified agency. When we look at the laws related to cybersecurity in India, it is managed through the Information Technology Act 2000, which itself needs revision, the National Cybersecurity Policy 2013, and the Digital Personal Data Protection Act 2023. Now, what are the suggestions that we can give for ensuring cybersecurity in India? One, we need a comprehensive statute. Right now, it is dealt with under the IT Act 2000 and the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, we need a specific cyber security act also. We need a dedicated and the nodal agency as well for ensuring cyber security, and we need a national cyber security strategy as well. The Data Security Council of India came up with the National Cyber Security Strategy, focusing upon some areas including the securing of the national cyberspace, for ensuring that there is sectoral preparedness as there is a large scale digitization of the services, the strengthening of the architecture through the budget allocation, the research and development, capability building, audit and assistance, data security, and the synergy as well for ensuring that there are standards also which are developed. There is cyber insurance, cyber diplomacy, and cyber crime investigation, which can be focused upon through the National Cyber Security Strategy proposed by the Data Standards Council of India. Plus, we need to develop our offensive capabilities as well. Just defensive capabilities may not suffice. For example, it will create deterrence, and we may develop softwares to intercept attacks as well. Then we can go for the air gapping measures. For example, the computers, the gadgets which are connected directly to the critical systems, they should not be connected to internet as well. Whenever some data is to be transferred, it can be transferred through a hard drive separately, so that they are not vulnerable to online attacks, to cyber attacks. That is known as air gapping. And we should develop our capabilities in big data analytics and also in cloud computing. And we can go for the international cooperation as well to ensure India is not a victim of cyber related threats. There is a mains practice question also. With the rapid digitization of governance and economy, cybersecurity has emerged as a critical national concern. Discuss the major challenges India faces in ensuring cybersecurity. Evaluate the existing institutional architecture and strategy to tackle cyber threats, and suggest measures to strengthen India's cyber resilience. There are a few previous year questions also related to cyber security, as it is one of the favorite topics of UPSC. For example, discussing the potential threats of cyber attack and security framework to prevent it, and another one targeting for the types of cyber crimes and the measures required to be taken to fight the menace. The next article is related to India-UK FTA and the benefits that India will get from it, and the concerns associated with the free trade agreement. This is important in GS2 under the topic bilateral, regional and global groupings and agreements affecting India's interests and or involving India. Let's look at the sectors in which India stands to gain and UK also stands to gain. When we look at the export sectors, India stands to gain as there will be tariff elimination for textiles, apparels, gems, jewelry, leather, machinery, auto parts, pharma products, chemicals, processed foods, etc., which are exported from India to UK. UK also stands to gain as it will get duty-free access for 64% of its export from UK to India, for example, alcoholic beverages, cosmetics, processed food, digital services, etc. When we look at the impact of the tariff, India stands to gain significantly because there will be zero reduced tariff for 99% of Indian exports to UK. Therefore, we will have a defined advantage versus Vietnam, versus China, versus Bangladesh, because the goods that will be exported from these countries to UK, they will still be levied with tariffs, but the exports from India to UK, that will be having zero or reduced tariffs. UK also stands to gain simultaneously. For example, the average tariffs upon the imports from UK into India, presently it is about 15%, it will be brought down to just 3%. Simultaneously, for example, it will stand to gain like in Scotch whisky. The imports on Scotch whisky into India, it is tariffed. From UK to India, it is tariffed presently at 150%. It will be reduced immediately to 75% and to about 40% in the next 10 years. The MSMEs also stand to gain, and there will be regional growth as well. For example, the export will give a boost and the manufacturing clusters will stand to gain. For example, the manufacturing clusters like for textiles in Tirupur, Pune, Chennai, etc. in Ludhiana as well. And UK also stands to gain as it will get market access for the brands of UK. For example, the brands including the Jaguar, Aston Martin, etc. There will be professional mobility as well, as through the FTA there will be a mutual recognition of the professional qualifications, and the visa relaxation norms will be put in place, and there will be waivers for the social security as well. UK stands to gain as it will get 60,000 Indian professionals, and therefore it will be able to fill the skill gaps in UK, and Indians will be employed there, particularly in the sectors like engineering and finance. Simultaneously, there will be collaboration and gain in the sectors of green technology and energy, as UK will be investing in the solar energy, hydrogen, battery technology and the electric vehicles infrastructure building in India, and UK will therefore get the strategic entry into the clean energy market of India. Also, in the category of agriculture and food processing, India stands to gain as there will be duty-free treatment for 95% of agriculture tariff lines, and this will give a boost to the trade and export of basmati, spices, tea, seafood, etc. from India. For example, the export of shrimps and tuna. And the UK also stands to gain as there will be lesser regulations in India. The marine and fisheries sector particularly gains from the FTA, as there will be duty free access for 99% of the marine products, and UK stands to gain as it will get more choices, more options related to the premium seafood import. Related to the geographical indicators, protection will be given in UK for the Indian GI products, for example Nashik wine, toddy, feni, etc. And UK therefore also will get the preferential access for the high quality Indian cultural products. Regarding the consumer impact, it will be good for the consumers, as the consumers in India will get access to cheaper luxury cars from UK, as well as the spirits, wines, etc. And in UK as well, the consumers will get access to cheaper Indian textiles, pharmaceuticals, processed foods and jewelry. There will be strategic gains as well, as India may be able to access the European Union as well through the hubs of the United Kingdom, and UK stands to gain as it will be able to strengthen the digital and defense links with India. But there are certain concerns also associated with the India-UK Free Trade Agreement, especially the public health concerns as highlighted in the article. For example, there will be a risk that UK made unhealthy food will gain more entry into India. The HFSS food, the high fat, salt and sugar food will gain more entry in India because of the tariff-free entry. It will lead to the rise in the obesity, diabetes, the non-communicable diseases. Plus, there is aggressive marketing as well for the cheap and unhealthy foods, which will promote its consumption. At the same time, the regulation in India is weak as compared to UK. In UK, there is a ban on the HFSS ads before 9 p.m. and also the nutrition labels have to be traffic light. That is, they have to be clear and they should be clearly visible, and the consumer should be able to identify easily what is the nutrition levels in various products. On the contrary, rather, even the proposed mandatory front of pack warning labels in India have been stalled. That is, there should be a clear front of the pack warning labels on the packets of food that should warn the consumers regarding the nutritional information. That has been stalled by the industry lobby, which are rather pushing for the star ratings, the star markings for the foods, which will be confusing for the consumers. Also, we can learn from Mexico. The lessons from Mexico highlight that after it entered into the free trade agreement, the NAFTA, there was a surge in the consumption of the unhealthy foods, the surge in the consumption of high fat, salt and sugar foods, which led to the increase in the non-communicable diseases in Mexico. And although there were corrective steps also, for example, the imposition of soda tax, but it was too late. Therefore, it may lead to the rising lifestyle diseases in India also, which is already going through a high burden of obesity and diabetes. Plus, we need to also be wary of the trade-off between the economic gains versus the health. And there are some urgent safeguards also which are needed. For example, we can have mandatory warning labels, for example like Chile does, and imposing a black octagonal label on the food products. The ban should be there on the HFSS ads which are targeting children. The school meals should be healthier. There can be a ban on the junk foods in the school canteens, and the public health oversight also needs to be strengthened in the trade negotiations as well. The next article is related to coral bleaching, as the coral cover in Lakshadweep has seen a 50% reduction. This is important in GS3 under the topic Conservation, Environmental Pollution and Degradation. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding corals and coral bleaching. The corals are marine invertebrates or animals who do not have a spine. Each coral is called a polyp. Thousands of such polyps live together to form a colony. And they can be hard corals or soft corals. Hard corals are those corals which extract calcium carbonate from the seawater and frame the structure, the skeleton of the coral reef, and the soft corals usually live on the hard corals, the skeletons built by their ancestors. Now, what is coral bleaching? The corals usually have a symbiotic relationship with the microscopic algae known as the zooxanthellae, and these algae are the coral's primary food source and they give them their color. But when the zooxanthellae start producing reactive oxygen species, when the symbiotic relationship becomes stressed, then the stress can be due to the increase in the oceanic temperature, the pollution, the oceanic acidity, etc. Then the microscopic algae starts leaving the coral. It leaves the coral very pale, very white, and this is known as the bleaching of the coral. When there is severe bleaching and prolonged stress, it may lead to the coral death as well. Now, what causes coral bleaching? One of the major factors is the change in the ocean temperature. The climate change causes the increase in the oceanic temperatures, which causes the bleaching of the corals. Another factor is the runoff and pollution. When there is precipitation, the runoff water also reaches the ocean. It carries the pollutants also along with it, which bleaches the near shore corals. Another factor is overexposure to sunlight. When the temperature is high and there is high solar irradiance, it also causes bleaching in the corals. The extreme low tides is also another factor, as the exposure to air during the extreme low tides can also cause the bleaching of the corals. Now, what is the significance of the coral reefs? One, it ensures marine biodiversity because the coral reefs serve as the food for the marine life, for example fishes, and it gives economic contribution also. The global tourism industry also gets about $3 trillion because of tourism to the coral reefs. It gives protection from the storm waves as well. The coastlines are protected by the coral reefs from the storm waves. Now, when we see historically, there have been several mass bleaching events. For example, the El Nino induced bleaching in the Pacific Ocean of the corals in 1998, then in 2002 after the Indian Ocean tsunami, and 2014 to 2015 the Pacific Ocean as well as the Indian Ocean. Now, the climate change dramatically affects the coral reef ecosystems. For example, it causes the warming of the ocean and therefore causes thermal stress for the corals. The sea level rise, which causes the sedimentation, which chokes the corals, the polyps. The changes in the storm patterns, which again lead to the destruction of the reef structure. The changes in the precipitation, which leads to the algal blooms and the murky waters, which reduce the light, the sunlight access for the corals. The altering of the ocean currents, which leads to the lack of the food and the dispersal of larvae near the corals, and the oceanic acidification also, which decreases the growth rates and the structural integrity among the corals. Now, coming to the article, the study Local Environmental Filtering and the Frequency of Marine Heat Waves Influence Decadal Trends in Coral Composition, which is a 24-year-long study, has highlighted that the corals in Lakshadweep archipelago has declined to half of what they were in 1998 as a result of the marine heat waves and the exacerbation by the climate change. However, the local conditions such as the wave exposure depth, they also play the role in it. Now, the study also proposes the predictive framework which could help identify the vulnerable reefs and the reefs that may still have the potential which can be revived. When we observe the recovery rate has reduced over 24 years, the coral cover has declined from 37% to 19%, roughly 50% reduction from 1998. This decline was explained by reduced recovery rates after each bleaching event, despite the coral mortality decreasing with successive events. The next article is related to Telecom Policy 2025. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian Economy. The government has come up with the draft Telecom Policy 2025 with a vision of ensuring an India with a self-reliant, digitally empowered economy with universal, secure and future-ready connectivity. It aims to position India as a global leader in telecom technology, innovation and manufacturing. The policy is based upon 6 strategic missions. The first mission is ensuring universal and meaningful connectivity to the telecom for every Indian. It is to ensure 100% 4G and 90% 5G coverage by 2030 in India, and it will be done through the Digital Bharat Nidhi, especially in the rural areas. The government aims to fiberize 80% of the towers through the draft policy and connect all Gram Panchayats via the BharatNet fiber. And there will be installation of 1 million public Wi-Fi hotspots under the PM Wani scheme, and there will be the setting of satellite and non-terrestrial networks for the remote areas, for the access to internet in the remote areas. The second mission is innovation. It is to place India among the top 10 global hubs for 5G, 6G, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things and quantum technology. For this, the government will be supporting 500 plus telecom startups under the draft policy and boost the R&D spending as well. It aims to develop standard essential patents for ensuring global leadership and setting up telecom data sandbox for anonymized data use, that is to ensure the regulatory reforms. And the third mission of the draft policy is to promote domestic manufacturing in the telecom sector so that the telecom manufacturing output can be increased by 150%, and there is the aim of 50% import substitution and the setting up of telecom manufacturing zones and 30 advanced research labs as well. The government will try to generate 1 million jobs in the sector through the draft policy and launch industry aligned courses, for example 5G, IoT, Internet of Things and quantum technology. The fourth pillar of the policy is ensuring a secure and trusted network, that is through investments in quantum resistant cryptography for cyber security, establishment of a national telecom safe net for threat resilience, and strengthening of biometric based telecom user identification, as well as enforcing an AI driven threat detection. The fifth pillar is ensuring ease of living and ease of doing business, and this will be achieved through the reduction in the grievance redressal time by 50%, simplifying compliance via digital by design approach, and infrastructure sharing among the telecom operators and increasing the spectrum efficiency. Therefore, the final pillar of the draft policy is to ensure sustainability in the telecom sector by reducing the carbon footprint of the telecom sector by 30% and transitioning 30% of telecom towers to renewable energy. It also aims to promote e-waste recycling and adoption of the circular economy models and adoption of the right to repair framework. That is to ensure that the MNCs who are going for planned obsolescence are also checked, and there should be the right to repair also, so that the customer or the consumer, if he has bought any electronic equipment or any gadget, he should also be able to repair it rather than being forced to go for a new device. The key targets under the draft policy for 2030 include the doubling of the GDP contribution from the telecom sector and achieving 1 lakh crore annual investment in the telecom infrastructure, doubling of the telecom exports and R&D spending, as well as upskilling 1 million workers for future telecom sector demands. The next article is related to Thailand-Cambodia dispute. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Policies and Politics of Developing and Developed Countries on India's Interests. The two countries, Thailand and Cambodia, are fighting, and the fight is regarding the border dispute as well as the Pre Vihar temple. This fight is not new, it has a historical background also. For example, it dates back to the colonial era border disputes, where there was the dispute regarding the interpretation of the French and the Siamese maps. In 1962, the International Court of Justice gave a ruling in favor of Cambodia, where it awarded that the Pre Vihar temple is in Cambodia, which was not agreed to by Thailand. In 2008, the Cambodia went for the listing of the Pre Vihar temple as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which again led to the reigniting of the tensions between the two countries. And in 2011-12, there was a ruling from the ICJ again regarding the belonging of the Pre Vihar temple in Cambodia, which was rejected by Thailand. And now it is a matter of the national pride and politics also, because neither side wants to concede, and there are therefore economic as well as cultural tensions. For example, the temple antiquities, the cross-border trade and the access to resources in the region. Now, what has caused the most recent clash? In May 2024, there was a skirmish as a Cambodian soldier was killed in the Chongbok region. In June this year, there was a landmine explosion in which the 3 Thai soldiers were injured and the Thailand blamed it on Cambodia. There is simultaneously the border militarization also which happened, and the diplomatic breakdown also took place as Thailand closed the border crossings. It expelled Cambodia's envoy, and Cambodia also retaliated by imposing bans on Thai imports, the imports regarding energy also and media. And then there was a leaked phone call as well. The phone call conversation which was leaked by the Cambodian Senate president that he made with the Thai president, whereby she had called him as uncle and criticized the Thai military leadership, and therefore it led to a snowballing effect. And the recent Thursday clashes, there was fighting near the Prasutta Mon Thom temple. Both sides now blame each other for firing first. Now, what will be the implications of this clash? There will be regional and bilateral implications. For example, the ASEAN has its own limitations. There, the norms are non-interventionist, and the conflict resolution may not be done therefore at the ASEAN stage, and they may have to be done bilaterally between the two countries, and the trade disruptions will be there. And the cross-border communities will be the ones who will be the hardest hit, and Thailand's credibility may also take a hit. For example, the political instability, it weakens the regional trust in Thailand. The Cambodia strategy will also be tested as it will be testing the ASEAN unity therefore, and it causes long-term risks as well. For example, these are historical disputes which are fueled now by nationalism and domestic politics also, and the ASEAN infrastructure projects may be put at risk because of such clashes, and the diplomatic de-escalation also will hinge upon the political will which may be shown by both the countries. The next article is related to dissent in democracy. This is important in GS2 under the topic governance. Before coming to the article, let's discuss what is the significance of dissent in a democracy. It guarantees the right to freedom of speech and expression is not curtailed, which can't be done in a democracy, and even the Indian Constitution under Article 19 subclause 1 subclause A allows for the right to freedom of speech and expression. Also, the preamble to the Indian Constitution even gives the liberty of thought, expression, faith, belief and worship, and the citizens can therefore function like watchdogs in the democracy if the dissent is protected, it is preserved. It can give the feedback to the government and ensure a representative democracy through direct participation. And the majoritarianism per se is an antithesis to the democracy, but the dissent makes sure that there is a necessary voice which is provided to the oppressed, to the marginalized sections also. And anyway, the state can always use force to suppress a violent protest, but the peaceful dissent can be allowed, and it is a cornerstone of a constitutional democracy therefore. And hence, in the words of Tagore, where the mind is free and the head is held high, in that heaven, O my father, let my country awake. Now let's also have a look at some of the examples of dissent. The judicial dissent can be seen, for example, Justice H.R. Khanna upholding the right to life and personal liberty in the ADM Jabalpur case. The political protests, for example, Gandhiji taking up the indigo cultivation, the salt tax issues. The religious dissent, for example, the Protestantism, the Siddharth Gautam, Martin Luther King Jr. The people's movements, for example, anti-Vietnam War protests in US, which exposed the lies of the US government, the Velvet Revolution and the Romanian Revolution, which overthrew the authoritarian regimes. These are all golden examples of dissent. Now, coming to the article, the author has certain concerns regarding the Public Security Bill of Maharashtra and the definition of left-wing extremism. The author observes that there is a lack of legal clarity regarding the definition of left-wing extremism, and without clearly defining it, the Maharashtra bill criminalizes it. Therefore, the author says that it might end up criminalizing dissent in a democracy. And because there is a lack of clarity, there is vagueness, therefore there is a risk of misuse, and the rhetoric of urban nexus, it is used to conflate the dissent with extremism. Plus, there is an overlap with the existing laws, the provisions of the Maharashtra Public Security Bill. Many activities mentioned which are banned there are already illegal in the existing laws under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act as well as the Indian Penal Code, and therefore they are like duplicate legal instruments, which increases the executive overreach.
Plus, there is a threat to the free speech and dissent, as the criticism of government could be framed as endangering peace under the Public Security Bill of Maharashtra, and there is no pre-screening mechanism also. First, the police acts, it can arrest the person, and the advisory board usually intervenes later only. Also, there is the fear of the selective enforcement highlighted by the author, that the right-wing incitement is ignored by the bill. For example, the incitement may be against the minorities, and the broader democratic implications also need to be considered, as the bill may end up criminalizing the protest and dissent, thereby weakening democracy as per the author. Thank you.